Ethan had been riding since early morning, moving slowly across the quiet land that stretched far beyond his ranch. His horse, a calm brown gelding named Dusty, stepped softly on the dry earth as the wind pushed warm air across the open fields. Ethan lived alone on a small ranch miles away from the nearest town, so he only came out this far when he truly needed supplies. He never enjoyed crowded places, but he enjoyed hard work, simple people, and honest deals. Today, he needed feed, tools, and maybe a few small things to repair a broken gate back at home. The town was small. Not much more than a dusty street with a few wooden buildings and a line of small stalls, set up by traveling sellers who came on weekends. Ethan guided Dusty toward the market area, looking left and right with calm eyes, searching for anything useful. The sun was beginning to rise higher, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of leather and hay. People were slowly gathering, families with children, shopkeepers opening their doors, and sellers arranging goods on their tables. Among the many stalls, one caught Ethan's attention. It was an older wooden table with neat rows of handcrafted leather items, belts, small pouches, and a few saddlebags. Behind the table stood an elderly seller with silver hair and kind eyes. His hands moved slowly, showing the careful work of someone who had spent his life crafting things with patience, not speed. He looked tired, but peaceful in a way that made Ethan pause. Ethan stopped his horse a few steps away and tied Dusty to a post. Then he walked toward the table, letting his boots thump softly on the ground. He didn't say anything at first. He liked to look closely before speaking. One pair of saddlebags stood at a dark brown set with strong stitching and polished buckles. Beside them sat another pair, nearly identical, only a shade lighter. They looked new, unused, and made with great care. The seller noticed Ethan's interest and gave a small smile. "Good morning, son," the man said in a warm voice. "Fine day for travel." Ethan nodded politely. "Morning. Just passing through for supplies." The seller nodded back, wiping his hands on a cloth. He watched Ethan's eyes linger on the saddlebags. "Those two," the seller said, while pointing to them, "are made from strong hide. They'll last years if they're treated well." "They look solid," Ethan replied. He touched the leather lightly. It felt firm under his fingertips, smooth and perfectly shaped. "You make these yourself?" "Every piece," the seller answered. "Been doing it for 40 years. Ethan gave a small nod. He respected people who worked with their hands. The seller continued adjusting things on the table while Ethan examined the stitching. Everything about the bags showed skill and patience. Maybe because the seller had been quiet all morning, or maybe because he wanted to lighten the mood. He suddenly let out a soft laugh and said in a joking tone, "Buy one, get one free?" He said it casually, not expecting much. No one had bought anything from him yet. People walked past, choosing cheaper items from other stalls. The old man didn't expect a real buyer, much less someone taking his jokes seriously. But Ethan wasn't smiling. He didn't think the seller was joking. To him, an offer was an offer. A price was a price. And a fair deal was a fair deal. Without hesitation, he reached into his coat, took out the amount needed for one saddlebag, and placed the coins carefully on the table. "I'll take them both," Ethan said calmly. The seller froze for a moment. He blinked twice, confused. "Son, I was only making a joke." "You don't have to, I know," Ethan replied simply. "But you said it. And I need good gear." The seller stared at him, surprised and slightly amused. It had been a long time since anyone responded to him with such honesty. He gave a slow smile, the kind that reached his tired eyes. "Well then," he said softly, "a deal's a deal." He picked up the money and began wrapping the saddlebags carefully, treating them like something precious. His hands moved slower than they probably used to, but his movements were gentle. As he wrapped the bags, the seller began talking, not loudly, but in the soft tone of someone who rarely had anyone to speak to. "I made these for my two boys," he said quietly, "back when they used to ride with me. Thought they'd use them one day." Ethan paused. He hadn't asked anything personal, but sometimes people shared things without being asked. "They don't live here anymore?" Ethan asked gently. "No," the seller said, shaking his head with a sad smile. They moved far away, got busy with city life. Haven't visited much in the last few years? Ethan listened quietly. Talking wasn't his talent, but listening was. And sometimes that was more valuable, the seller continued, voice soft but steady. I made these saddlebags hoping they'd come back for a visit. I thought maybe they'd ride out with me the way we used to. But life takes people in different directions. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that feeling. Life had also taken him away from many people he once knew. Too many of them had drifted away over time. For a few long seconds, neither of them said anything. The noise of the market continued around them, but the space between them felt quiet like a small island in the middle of a crowded place. Finally, the seller placed the wrapped saddlebags on the table. Ethan reached for them, but he paused again when he looked at the older man's face. The seller had a smile, but there was a sadness behind it. It's a kind that comes from years of hoping and being disappointed. You all right? Ethan asked in a calm voice. The seller lifted his shoulders slowly. I manage. It gets lonely sometimes, selling alone. And getting old is not as easy as people think. But meeting someone honest like you, well, that's not something that happens every day. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to hearing personal things from strangers, but he felt something, a small pull inside him, similar to the feeling he had when he saw an injured animal or a broken fence that needed fixing. It wasn't pity. It was simply the desire to help, before he could say much. The seller added quietly, Thank you for taking the offer seriously. It means more than you know. Ethan picked up the saddlebags and held them under his arm. Good work deserves respect, he said simply. Then he turned to leave, but he didn't walk away yet. Something made him stay a moment longer. Maybe it was the way the seller's hands trembled slightly when picking up another item. Maybe it was the quiet sadness in the man's eyes. Or maybe it was just the cowboy in him, the part that didn't like seeing someone carry a heavy load alone. He shifted his boots, looked around the stall, and said, You need help with anything? The seller looked surprised again, as if he didn't expect kindness twice in the same hour. No, you've already bought something. That's more than enough. Ethan shook his head a little. Buying something doesn't stop me from helping. The seller opened his mouth to protest, but Ethan was already stepping behind the table, gently lifting a heavy crate that the old man had been struggling with earlier. For Ethan, helping wasn't something to talk about, it was something to do. In that simple moment, born from a small joke and an honest heart, quietly began something neither of them expected. Ethan stood behind the stall with the heavy crate still in his hands, and the seller watched him with a mixture of surprise and concern. The old man tried to tell him again that he didn't need help, but Ethan placed the crate in a safe spot without saying a word. Helping someone felt as natural to him as breathing, so he didn't think twice about it. The seller opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally let out a soft sigh that carried both relief and gratitude. You must have other places to be, the seller said gently. I don't want to keep you. Ethan shook his head. I have time. That was true. He had planned to buy, feed, pick up some small tools, and ride back to his ranch before evening. But the way the seller spoke earlier had been on his mind. There was a heaviness in the old man's tone when he mentioned his sons, a sadness that didn't leave easily. Ethan wasn't someone who talked much, but he understood loneliness. It lived quietly inside him too, in the long nights on the ranch and in the silent mornings before sunrise. The seller slowly sat down on a small wooden stool behind the table. His legs looked stiff, as if they'd been working too hard for too many years. Ethan noticed it and began to rearrange the items on the stall, leather belts on one side, polished pouches lined up neatly. Saddlebags hung carefully on hooks so passing buyers could see them clearly. You don't have to do all that, the seller said. I know, Ethan replied calmly, but it looks better this way. The seller smiled a little. You have an eye for order. My mama did, Ethan said softly. She liked everything in its place. There was a long moment of silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural. Two people working quietly side by side. Nearby, the sound of footsteps and murmuring voices filled the market. A small group of children ran past laughing, and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted across the street again. The seller finally asked, "Where's your family, son?" Ethan paused. It wasn't a painful question, just a personal one. He placed a leather belt on a hook before answering. "I'm on my own now. My folks passed a long time ago." The seller's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. It's all right," Ethan said simply. "I keep busy. That helps." The seller nodded. Yes, work fills the quiet spaces. For a few minutes, they continued cleaning up the stall together. Ethan fixed a loose hinge on one side of the table, tightening the screws with a pocket tool he always carried. Then he straightened the display cloth and brushed away some dust that had gathered from the wind. When he stepped back, the seller blinked in surprise. "It looks different, better. It'll draw more people," Ethan replied, almost as if the market heard him. Two women approached the stall and began examining the leather belts. They asked the seller questions about the stitching and how long the belts might last. With Ethan standing behind the table and helping show the items, the women bought 2 belts within minutes. The seller looked at Ethan with grateful eyes. "Seems you bring good luck." Ethan shook his head. "Just helped clean." But the seller knew it was more than that. Many people passed by a lonely-looking stall, but a clean, organized one with someone standing confidently behind it drew more attention. Ethan's quiet presence made the stall feel alive. More customers came. Some asked about the pouches, some about the saddlebags. A few even bought keychains that had been sitting untouched all morning. The seller's hands trembled slightly when he handled money or wrapped items. But Ethan stepped in whenever he saw the man struggling. He didn't speak loudly or suddenly. He simply moved at the right time, offering silent help where it was needed. As the hours passed, the seller found himself talking more than usual. Not in the loud way of a salesman, but in a gentle, honest manner that came naturally to him. "You know," said softly during a slow moment, "I didn't think I'd sell much today. Most people don't want handmade things anymore. They want cheap items that break in a month." Ethan glanced at the leatherwork. "Your work won't break." The seller smiled proudly. "I've always believed that if you make something with patience and care, it holds a part of you inside it." Ithana nodded. He understood that. On his ranch, he fixed fences, cared for animals, and worked the land with steady hands. Every task he completed carried a piece of his effort. "Did your boys help you with your craft?" Ethan asked. "Oh yes," the seller said, eyes lighting up with old memories. "When they were young, they sat with me in the workshop. They'd watch me cut the leather, punch holes, thread the needles. They used to fight over who got to test the new belts." The smile faded slowly. But life changed. They grew up. They left. I suppose I can't blame them. "What do they do now?" Ethan asked carefully. "One works in an office far away. The other, I don't know exactly," the seller admitted quietly. "He travels a lot. He sends a message now and then, says he's fine. But I haven't seen him in years." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't know the seller's sons, but he could imagine what it felt like to hope for them to visit and never see it happen. "You're strong," Ethan said, meaning it. "Not many people your age keep working like this." The seller gave a small laugh. "Strong? These old bones disagree with you? But I try. It keeps me moving. It keeps my mind clear." A young couple approached the stall, interrupting the moment. They bought a pair of pouches, admiring the fine handiwork. When they left, the seller counted his coins and quietly whispered, "Today might be my best day in months." Ethan didn't say anything. He simply helped pack the items and kept the stall organized. A part of him felt something warm, like he was doing something good, not for money, not for praise, but simply because the seller deserved a better day. After another hour, the seller finally sat down again, tired but smiling. His eyes were brighter now, like someone who had been given a small piece of hope. "You remind me of my boys," the seller said softly to Ethan, "not in looks, but in the way you move. The way you help without waiting to be asked." Ethan looked down at his hands. "Just doing what feels right," the seller nodded. "That's rare these days." Quiet breeze rolled through the market, lifting the corner of the tablecloth. Ethan placed a small stone on it so it wouldn't fly away. Everything around them seemed calmer now. People drifted in and out, and the stall no longer looked forgotten. You know? The seller said in a thoughtful voice. For a moment when you took those saddlebags, I felt something strange. Like I was letting go of something heavy, and I didn't realize how long I had been carrying it. Ethan looked at him with steady eyes. Maybe they were waiting for someone who would use them right. The seller smiled. Maybe so. For the first time in months, he felt lighter. Not because he had sold many items, but because someone had stood beside him, listened to him, and treated him with respect without asking for anything in return, as the afternoon sun began to dip slightly. The seller packed away coins into a small box. His hands were tired, but his heart felt strong. You've done more for me today than you know, he said quietly. Ethan didn't answer with words. He simply nodded once, the kind of nod that carried sincerity and a quiet promise. And although neither of them said it out loud, both felt it. This simple day in the market had become something meaningful, something that connected to strangers who carried their own silent stories. As the afternoon went on, the market grew busier. More people filled the area, and the sound of chatter mixed with the clinking of coins and the rustling of bags. Ethan stayed near the seller's stall, helping whenever needed, even though he had originally come only for supplies. The sun was warm on his shoulders, but he didn't mind. Something about the seller's lonely calmness made him want to stay a little longer. A new customer approached, a man in his 30s, with dusty boots and a horse tied nearby. He picked up one of the leather pouches, turning it over in his hands. Ethan stepped aside so the seller could speak to him, but the seller's voice trembled slightly as he tried to explain the details. Without being asked, Ethan quietly lifted another pouch and showed the buyer the stitching. Saying only a few simple, honest words about how long the leather would last, the buyer nodded, impressed, and bought 2 pouches. When he left, the seller looked at Ethan as if he still couldn't understand why a stranger would stay so long and help so much. You speak simply, the seller said, but your words carry truth. People can feel that, Ethan shrugged. I only say what I see. The seller smiled in a gentle way. It had been a long time since he felt this kind of company quiet, steady, respectful. After the small rush of customers ended, the seller rubbed his knees slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to stand. Ethan stepped forward without a word, offering his arm. The seller accepted, and once steady on his feet, he gave a small grateful nod. You remind me of the ranch hands I grew up around, the seller said softly. Strong, quiet men who helped without talking much. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he just stood beside him. The wind carried the smell of warm sand and distant grass as the sun began to lean lower in the sky. Across the market, a young boy dropped a basket of apples, scattering them everywhere. Ethan watched as people walked around the boy, too busy to help. For a brief moment, the seller thought Ethan might run over to help the child, but Ethan stayed put. He simply watched until an older woman nearby knelt down to pick the apples with the boy. Ethan smiled faintly. He didn't need to help every person, just the ones whose eyes carried a certain loneliness as the day moved closer to evening. The seller's stall looked cleaner and more organized than it had in years. Items were placed neatly, tools were put away properly, and even the cloth covering the table looked straight and smooth. People passing by gave it more attention than before, some out of curiosity, some out of genuine interest. The seller sat down again, his shoulders relaxed. This old stall hasn't looked this good in a very long time, he said softly. You made the goods, Ethan replied. I just lined them up. The seller shook his head. Sometimes, a second pair of hands changes everything. Ethan leaned against a wooden post, arms folded, watching the flowing crowd. Dusty, his horse, waited patiently nearby, occasionally shaking his mane or swishing his tail. Every now and then, Ethan walked over to check on him, giving the horse a quiet pat on the neck. By late afternoon, Seller looked down at the small wooden box holding the day's earnings. His eyes widened slightly. There were more coins in that box than he had collected in the last several weekends combined. For a moment, he pressed a hand over his heart, surprised by how deeply the sight touched him. I haven't had a day like this in years. He whispered Ethan didn't want praise, so he just nodded. but the seller's voice had a faint tremble, not of fear but of gratitude. And that was enough to make Ethan stay a little longer by the table. A mother with her daughter came next. The little girl pointed at the keychains, tiny leather shapes of horses, stars, and boots. She chose one, and Ethan knelt beside her to hand it to her gently, explaining how it was carefully made and would last a long time if she kept it safe. The little girl smiled shyly before running back to her mother. "That small sale means more to me than any big one," the seller murmured. "It reminds me of times when my boys were little." "Kids grow fast," Ethan said, "but memories stay." The seller nodded slowly, touched by the truth in those simple words. As the market began winding down, some sellers started packing their stalls. The sky took on a golden shade, painting long shadows across the ground. The seller rubbed his tired hands together, but he looked healthier, almost younger, than he had that morning. "You must have a lot of chores waiting on your ranch," the seller said. "I hope I haven't kept you too long." "No trouble," Ethan replied. "I'll get things done. There's still daylight." "You're a good man," the seller said quietly. Ethan looked away, slightly uncomfortable. He didn't see himself as anything special. He simply believed that if someone needed help, you helped them. That simple. The seller began packing the lighter items first, and Ethan stepped forward to help with the heavier ones. He lifted crates gently, making sure not to strain the old man further. He folded the table legs, securing them carefully so the wood wouldn't crack. "You really don't have to do all this," the seller kept saying, but his tone held more warmth than refusal. "I'm already here," Ethan replied. "Might as well finish the job." As they worked, the seller spoke again, voice soft but steady. "Most people hurry through life. They don't slow down. They don't notice when someone else is falling behind." "Some things are worth noticing," Ethan said. The seller blinked, his eyes shining with quiet appreciation. "I'm glad you noticed today." When the stall was nearly packed, the seller reached for the last crate, but his hand slipped slightly. Ethan stepped in just in time, holding it steady. "You all right?" Ethan asked. The seller exhaled slowly. "Just tired. But it's a good kind of tired today." Ethan helped him place the crate on the cart behind the stall. When everything was loaded, the seller stood still for a moment, his breath calm, his face peaceful. He looked around the market, the other sellers, the families, the warm sky, and then turned to Ethan. "You've done more for me today than you know," the seller said quietly. "Not just helping with the stall. You helped me remember what it feels like to talk, to be seen, to feel useful again." Ethan didn't speak right away. He looked at the saddlebags he had bought earlier, resting securely on Dusty's saddle. Then he looked at the seller. "You make good work," he said. "People should see it." The seller nodded, touched. "And if they don't?" "At least someone did today." Ethan gave a small, rare smile. Then he picked up the last bundle of cloth and handed it to the seller. The market was closing now. People were returning to their homes. Children were being gathered by their parents. And the warm light of sunset wrapped the town in a soft glow. Ethan stood quietly, watching the seller finish tying the final rope on his cart. Something warm moved inside his chest, something he wasn't used to. It was the quiet feeling that helping someone, even for a single day, could change a life in ways he didn't fully understand. The seller breathed out slowly and said, "Thank you, son." And Ethan, with his calm voice and steady eyes, simply replied, "Anytime." The day wasn't over yet, but both of them knew it had already become something more than just a day at the market. It had become a small turning point for both their hearts, gentle, silent, and real. Ethan stood with the seller as the market slowly emptied around them. The warm evening light covered the street, giving everything a soft gold color. Sellers were packing their last items. Children were running to their families, and horses tied. Along the posts were shaking their heads as if waiting to return home. Dusty, Ethan's horse, watched him with calm eyes. Knowing it would soon be time to leave, the seller took a slow breath, steadying himself after a full day of work. His hands still trembled a little, but there was a peaceful look on his face that hadn't been there earlier. He turned to Ethan and held out a small bundle of cloth. "You dropped this?" the seller said, But Ethan knew he hadn't. The seller just wanted to give him something more. Ethan shook his head. That's yours. But the seller gently placed it in Ethan's hands. Just take it. It's a small thing I made last winter. I don't sell many of them. I'd like you to have it. Ethan opened the cloth and found a simple leather wristband with neat stitching. It wasn't fancy, but it showed the same patience and care the seller put into everything. Ethan looked at it for a moment before quietly slipping it on his wrist. Thank you, he said in his calm voice. It's nothing, the seller replied, though his eyes said it meant something to him. They both stood in silence for a few seconds. Watching the final sellers leave. The market that had been full of noise and movement all day now felt soft and gentle. The light breeze made the stall cloth sway. The shadows grew longer across the ground. Ethan finally reached for the heavy saddlebags he had bought earlier. He lifted them with ease and fastened them securely onto Dusty's saddle. The horse turned its head slightly as if examining the new pieces of leather. They fit him well, the seller said with a small smile. They'll last a long time, Ethan replied. The seller nodded slowly. I'm glad they're going to someone who'll take care of them. Ethan didn't say anything more, but the seller could see the quiet respect in his eyes. Once everything was tied, Ethan turned back to the seller. You need help getting home? He asked. The seller shook his head. My cart is light today. I sold enough, thanks to you. I'll manage. Ethan didn't argue, simply stood there, watching to make sure the seller walked steady and didn't stumble. The seller noticed and gave a faint laugh. You watch over people even when they don't ask, he said softly. Ethan looked away, adjusting Dusty's reins. Just making sure you're all right. The seller picked up the small rope that held his cart and pulled it gently. It rolled smoothly now, lighter after the full day of sales. He walked slowly, and Ethan walked beside him for a few steps. You'll be back next week? The seller asked, with hope in his voice. Depends on work at the ranch, Ethan said. But I'll come when I can. The seller gave a grateful nod. I'd like that. Something warm settled in Ethan's chest. He wasn't used to people wanting him around. He lived quietly, worked quietly, and rarely stayed long enough in town to make any connections. But today felt different. Something simple and honest had formed a bond that didn't need loud words or promises. They stopped near the edge of the market where the road split into two directions. One leading to the seller's small home outside town, the other stretching toward Ethan's ranch far off in the open land. The seller stood still, looking at the road ahead. He took a shaky breath before speaking again. I don't get many visitors, he admitted. It was nice having someone stand by me today. Ethan felt the weight of those words. Came from a man who had lived through years of quiet days, long evenings, and memories that sometimes felt heavier than the crates he carried. You deserved a good day, Ethan said gently. The seller gave a small smile. Maybe so. Ethan climbed onto Dusty, adjusting himself in the saddle. The horse lifted its head and stamped the ground softly, ready to move. Ethan looked down at the seller, who stood with his cart beside him. If you ever need anything tools, help with repairs, just ask, Ethan said. The seller blinked in surprise. I don't want to trouble you. It's not trouble, Ethan replied. The seller looked at him for a long moment. Then without speaking, he reached out and placed a hand on Dusty's neck, stroking the horse gently. Dusty stood still, calm and relaxed under the seller's touch. You take care of him? The seller whispered. He takes care of me, Ethan said. The seller nodded slowly. That's how it is with good horses. Another moment of quiet passed. The sky was now turning orange and pink, and small lights began to appear in the windows of nearby homes. It was time to go. Ethan tugged lightly on the reins, and Dusty took a step forward. The saddlebags shifted slightly but stayed firmly in place. Ethan gave a last look at the seller. I'll see you around, said. I'll look forward to it, the seller replied softly. Ethan rode away at a slow pace, letting Dusty walk calmly through the fading evening light. He didn't rush. The day had been long, but it had been filled with something rare, a connection that didn't need explaining as he moved farther down the road. The sound of the market faded behind him. Birds settled on rooftops, the wind softened, and the world grew quieter with each step Dusty took. Ethan felt a calmness inside him, the kind that came when a day ended in a good way. He looked down at the saddlebags resting against Dusty's sides. The dark brown leather, carefully stitched and polished, seemed to shine under the fading sun. He remembered the seller's hands making them, the quiet pride in his voice, and the memories behind them. These weren't just saddlebags. They were pieces of someone's life, someone's effort, someone's story. And now they would travel with Ethan across open fields, quiet trails, and long ranch roads. They would remind him of the seller's quiet strength, his loneliness. In the small moment when a stranger stood beside him, the road stretched long ahead, but Ethan didn't mind. The rhythm of Dusty's steps matched the slow peace settling inside him. He thought about the seller walking home with his lightened cart, his tired hands gripping the handle, his heart a little less heavy than it had been that morning. Far behind him, the seller paused on his own road and watched Ethan disappear into the distance. The old man felt a small warmth inside, something like hope. He knew he might not see his sons soon. He knew his days would still be quiet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that someone out there cared enough to stand beside him for a whole day. Ethan finally reached the open land where the town faded into silence. The sky darkened slowly, stars beginning to appear. He breathed in the cool air and looked at the wristband the seller had given him. It felt right on his arm, like a quiet promise he didn't have to speak. As he rode on, the world around him softened. The land was wide, the sky was calm, and Ethan felt something new settle inside him. Not loneliness, but a gentle sense of connection. A reminder that even a simple day, even a simple conversation could make a difference. And deep in his heart, he knew he would return. Not for the market, not for supplies, but for the old seller who had given him more than saddlebags and small stories. He had given him a piece of human warmth, something rare and real, and Ethan would not forget it.